Hello and welcome back to another Monster Monday here on the Arcane Forge. My name is Josh, and for those of you unfamiliar, a Monster Monday is a video where I draw a creature from D&D, and I talk about its lore and its mythology and what it's like to fight in-game as well. Now I pose to my patrons over on Patreon what Fae creatures they would like to see this month, because it's February, it's my return to the channel after a very, very well-needed holiday, and I'm a fan of a portmanteau, so February seemed like the fitting thing to do. On my list of things that they got to vote on, though, I included Tooth Faries, which actually technically aren't really in D&D yet, but I've been using them for years with my own sort of tried and tested homebrew. It's a very basic homebrew, but it's very interesting, and I think you might get a lot out of it too, a lot of use out of the common variety of Tooth Fairy. With that said, let's get started with today's video. Bring these bone-gnashing varmints to life! All of my absolutely lovely patrons over on Patreon were extremely excited about this one, and so was I, to be honest. I use Tooth Fairies a lot in D&D. They're often the first types of fairies that my players encounter, and they usually set a really great tone for encounters with the Fae thereafter. While they don't actually appear currently in D&D 5e, 5th edition, I have a well-used and thankfully well-received homebrew stat block, which I use for these creatures, which I'll be sharing with you today, so that you too can plague your players with Tooth Fairies. There'll be a link to that down below in my description box, and this is absolutely free. You can also find it on my website, or on D&D Beyond, if you happen to follow me there as well. For those unfamiliar with the concept, fundamentally, Tooth Fairies are diminutive, flying sprites who congregate in large, locust-like swarms and have an obsession with collecting teeth and other bone-like structures or materials. While Tooth Fairies themselves have never been officially a part of D&D, at least as far as I'm aware, they are one of the more pervasive folk legends told around the world today. I'm not sure if this is a universal thing, or if this just happens in the UK and a few other places in Europe. So for those who aren't aware, when you're growing up and losing your baby teeth, in exchange for your second set of permanent teeth, parents here will tell their children to take the teeth which fall out and place them underneath their pillow when they go to bed. When they wake up, they'll notice that their tooth will have been taken by the Tooth Fairy, and in exchange she will have paid them for their kind donation in the form of a coin, usually 10p, 50p, or whatever the current exchange rate is on teeth to pound sterling, I suppose. She's usually depicted, if she is at all, as a feminine princess, not unlike Tinkerbell from Peter Pan, as Aldrin on my Discord server pointed out. And I should mention as well that down below in my description box there is a link to the Discord server, which you're very welcome to join. It's very active, very supportive, and very fun. Please make sure to come and say hi if you'd like to chat more and get a bit more out of the channel. But anyway, just like Tinkerbell from Peter Pan, the Tooth Fairy is usually an elegant sort of creature, usually wearing a flowing gown. They sometimes have a miniature crown or diadem, a starlit wand, and butterfly or dragonfly wings at her back. She's so small that she can land on your bed, sneak underneath your pillow, and replace your tooth with a coin without ever disturbing your sleep. While this creature is very cute on the face of it, it raises some rather alarming implications about the motivations and habits of the Tooth Fairy, or Tooth Fairies if there are multiple creatures who harvest teeth from children. Why does she want teeth? What does she do with them once she has them? Does she eat them? Carve them out to make a little house like a hermit crab? Why does she pay children for her enamel-encrusted prize? Would she take more teeth if she knew they were in the mouths of children? Or do they have to be ones which have fallen out? Does the existence of a tiny Tooth Fairy imply the existence of a much larger matriarch like Alpha Fairy, a bone angel, not sated by reaping the teeth of infants, but instead must devour the bones of the living? Do these minuscule menaces serve this dark mistress, collecting incisors and paying us mortals in the tenuously held ancient pact of no aggression, which at any time could crumble like the ancient dentures they hoard? Yes. Many of these fears were expertly represented in the 2008 film Hellboy and the Golden Army, where just such a peace between humans and the Fae was under strain. In the early moments of the film, paranormal investigators are swarmed with a tide of crawling quadrupedal tooth fairies who eat their victims' teeth first, quickly burrowing through their bodies, jumping down their throats and picking them to pieces, in search of anything enamel or calcium infused. This absolute nightmare is definitely something I chose to take heavy inspiration from in my homebrew version. So in my homebrew, I wanted to make these things something which are very small and perhaps a tiny bit troubling, a little menace if you found one by itself, but in greater numbers, in swarms, or in the service of a master, they could be a really useful tool. I wanted them to be something that is perhaps gross and weird, as is my wont with almost all creatures that you encounter in D&D. I wanted them to be something that might be overlooked, but if not dealt with, become a very serious issue. In my description of them, I said the following. I said the Tooth Fairies are terrible, diminutive, locust-like fae who have a near-endless hunger for enamel and calcium. Their tiny stature and round faces are often cause for them to be underestimated, but when travelling in swarms, or when serving a Fey master, they can be incredibly deadly. I said that it's well known that a Tooth Fairy can be placated by providing them with a child's tooth left under a pillow at night. Tooth Fairies will magically conjure a gold coin in payment of this offering as a sign of your safe passage. But if a band of hungry Tooth Fairies are lurking in the alleyways of your town, or in the bushes near your encampment, and none of your party have the forethought to carry a bag of loose teeth, then you may be met with an untimely end. Tooth Fairies have many rows of serrated teeth, which are strong enough to remain intact while crushing through bone. They use these to burrow through the faces of their victims, devouring every bone in their bodies, starting with their teeth. They will often make their nests in the hollowed-out fleshy bags of corpses that they leave behind, secreting a beehive-like mesh to hang their nest husks from trees and support the corpses from the inside to better disguise them as living humanoids. These statue-like hive corpses are often used to lure new victims towards the swarm if someone were to get lost alone at night. While Tooth Fairies are dangerous enough by themselves, they are never more efficient killers than when they are in the service of a Bone Fairy. Bone Fairies, or Tooth Fairy matriarchs, are believed by some to be bone devils who become lost for centuries in the Feywilds and are transformed by its power. Tooth Fairies can understand Sylvan and are keen to follow orders of a leader, but lack the intelligence to have complex social hierarchical structures themselves, more often than not, behaving more like insects than pixies or other more humanoid fae. When fae creatures of significant authority or power are able to command these creatures to do their bidding, Tooth Fairies gravitate towards them, protecting and serving this matriarch, while gaining easy access to the gaping mouths of their screaming victims that fae, with fear-inducing auras, tend to provide in exchange. So the stat block will fundamentally look fairly familiar to a lot of you. The basis for this stat block is not too dissimilar from a Sturge, a challenge 1/8 creature, which could very easily work as a Tooth Fairy if you so wanted to use something that's officially somewhat balanced in the game. However, I increased the challenge rating of this creature to 1/4 because I've given it a few extra features here or there. Its stat block is fundamentally the same, its strength, dexterity, and so on values are roughly the same because I wanted to have these creatures operate like massive insects. And by massive, I mean probably about the size of a fist. They have very few hit points, and their armor class is okay actually, at 14, due to the kind of bone-like skin that they have, and because they fundamentally operate at night, they have dark vision. But I didn't want these creatures to be intelligent. They only have 2 intelligence, so -4. They are animal-like, functioning on instinct, despite their somewhat humanoid appearance. I gave them a few rules to differentiate them from Sturges. The first one being Bone Harvester, that says any non-legendary undead creature, certainly those with exposed bones, take double damage from this creature's attacks. Non-magical armor made of bone that the Tooth Fairy attacks takes a permanent cumulative -1 penalty to armor class, and if its penalty drops to -3, the armor is destroyed. Hang on for a second. Just while I've got your attention, I wanted to take a second, and I will be as brief as I possibly can, to say a massive thank you to my patrons over on Patreon. For those of you who don't know, channels like myself, and probably most other content creators, rely on Patreon to make the content that we do. This probably won't be a shock, but I spend the equivalent time of a full-time job working purely on Arcane Forge stuff, whether it's illustrating everything, spending time researching and writing scripts, which might take days, editing all of the videos, and responding to as many of your comments as I possibly can. It takes up a while, basically. And while I absolutely love doing it, Myrtle has a hefty snack budget, and I want to make sure that the lights stay on here at the Arcane Forge. So if we were to meet in person and you'd not think twice about buying me a cup of coffee or a cup of tea or something like that, then I'd urge you to head over to Patreon and help me out for perhaps the price of a cup of coffee. Just like these particular patrons, who this month are Aldrin, Christian Palmer-Smith, AJ, Dominique Jolly, Sam Hickson, Dan Waterman, Tamerling, Steve Harrison, Max Copeland, Styrax, Ryan H., Colby Monroe, Darth Gaetana, Max Schluter, Peter Balfe, Alfie Wolf, Matt Lichtenwalner, Braxton Hudson, Cav Manick, Bartlegruff the Great, Daniel Williams, Nathan Stratton, Ethan Dibby, Amanda and Jake Westfall, The Smiling Sadist, John Foster, Yorick Beese, Nap in Camo, George Punton, Raptor Dio, Nicholas G. Silva, and Duck Quack. In addition to helping me to actually keep making these videos, they get a bunch of rewards, some of which include things like chatting with me one-to-one every single month, and a bunch of others, but I'll make sure to leave a link down below so you can find out for yourselves. But anyway, thank you for your support, and for those who are paying for this content to be made, and paying for those viewers who can't afford to pay for this content to be made. You are all legendary, so thank you so much, and let's get back to the topic at hand. Where were we? Now, as with a lot of things in D&D, I feel like there's a part of these rules that needs to be de-gamified. There needs to be almost a kind of parentheses section at the bottom that's, you know what I'm going for here. Because I'm not a huge fan of rules as written, as you will know, I'm far more into the flavour. What I was going for here is that creatures with a lot of exposed bone, very visible, or those who are using bone armour, are going to suffer more from creatures who eat it. Their armour might get chewed away. Zombies and skeletons might have this bone munched on first. So hopefully that will help inform your creative decisions if you come across creatures who don't count as undead, let's say, but who would equally suffer the wrath of this creature. In a rule called Enamel Eater, I've said that these creatures eat bones, but have a particular fondness for teeth. Any creatures currently under the effects of the frightened condition are considered easy targets for Tooth Fairies, as their wide open screaming mouths are a huge vulnerability. Tooth Fairies have advantage on attacks against frightened creatures. Again, the parentheses here, which I've chosen to omit, might include things like perhaps if there's a lot of spellcasters in your party who use verbal components. Maybe as their mouths must be open during this time, maybe Tooth Fairies have advantage to attack them too. It's certainly something worth considering as a dungeon master. And in a final rule, I've also said that these creatures, a rule called Tooth Toll, can be placated in an unusual way. If a creature willingly serves a Tooth Fairy with a tooth, which either they pull from their own mouths or if they happen to have some spare in a pouch nearby, the Tooth Fairy will attempt to purchase the tooth by magically conjuring a single gold coin. If this transaction is accepted, the Tooth Fairy will disengage and fly away with its prize. Tooth Fairies can perform this ability once per day, recharging at dawn. I've included this as a bit of a flavour for how Tooth Fairies actually operate in folklore, but I wanted to make sure that someone doesn't just grab a Tooth Fairy and use it as an unlimited gold engine. They can get 1 gold from this creature per day as long as they have a tooth to trade. I could see someone harvesting many Tooth Fairies to get a sort of constant stack of gold, but I also wanted to have a creative way to sort of defeat this creature, to end the combat with at least one of these creatures if you have enough teeth to hand to them. You might fight a shark, take many of its teeth after it's dead, and use those teeth to perhaps distract a swarm of Tooth Fairies. I would see that as a brilliantly creative way of subverting this encounter. I would definitely give my party the experience for, quote, defeating a Tooth Fairy encounter if they came up with something that creative, just for knowing the folklore and legends surrounding this creature. Fundamentally, I kept its bite attack very similar to that of a Sturge, saying that it does 1d4 plus 3 piercing damage, and that the Tooth Fairy tries to attach to the target while it's doing this. Thereafter, the Tooth Fairy doesn't need to roll to attack. It simply continues chomping away at someone's face, dealing a further 1d4 plus 3 hit points every turn. Due to its diminutive stature, that means that with a swarm of these things, multiple creatures could attach to a single target, quickly overwhelming them, but they're small enough that someone could be dealing with other targets, ignoring this creature draining away at their face, trying to eat their bones. So there's a tactical element to it. I said that someone can use their action to detach a Tooth Fairy from their face, ending this effect, or that the Tooth Fairy itself can simply fly away, using 5 feet of its movement so that it can attack someone else that's not intrinsically tied forever to munching away at one person's face if someone with more delicious looking teeth turns up. Finally, I've given it a rule called Tooth Pull as one of its actions. It says that while a Tooth Fairy is attached to a target, it can force that target to make a Constitution saving throw, which is very low, as it's not a particularly strong creature with only 4 strength. If the creature passes, this deals no damage, but on a failed save, the fairy removes a tooth from their mouth, dealing 1d10 piercing damage, a far cry from the 1d4 plus 3 piercing damage. But this forces the Tooth Fairy to detach itself from that person and fly away to safety, hopefully then getting a chance to eat this tooth that they've removed. And when they do so, when they spend a main action to eat the tooth, they regain 1d6 HP. So there you go. A diminutive fae can regenerate, can swarm all over people, can be ignored to your detriment and underestimated, but fundamentally has some really good tools in its toolkit, specifically against undead creatures and when under the service of someone who can cause fear. It's no secret that I took inspiration from the Hellboy Golden Army inspiration here, their interpretation. These are Guillermo del Toro creatures after all, and watching that film was the original inspiration for me to include this type of fairy in my D&D campaigns. I love the idea of subverting an expectation about a creature being cute and cuddly or beautiful and turning it into something menacing. But perhaps our folk tales are more polite and generous to these creatures than they actually appear. This is why they have these huge bulbous heads, very skinny and bony. But I wanted to have the silhouette fundamentally of a humanoid tooth fairy as we know it. So from the distance you might assume that there is some tiny floating human with beautiful perhaps wings flying towards you before you realise what's actually coming. That's one of the reasons why I also chose to include something more like a proper crown atop this fairy's head. I often choose to make my fae more insect-like, because insects are incredibly beautiful creatures, but also lack that level of humanity and therefore empathy that we project perhaps onto mammalian creatures to make them a bit more unnerving and a bit more unsettling. So you don't feel safe around the fae, and you certainly shouldn't feel safe around this creature, which is why I also chose to use elements that I included on my Bone Devil illustration a few years back. I wanted these things to be tiny little bone devils that are going to try and climb under your skin like the scarabs of those old mummy films. And I loved how these tiny little gross nightmare locusts came out in the end. I hope you like it as well. If you did, and you want to use these creatures in future, like I say, their stat block is down below in the description box or on my website or on D&D Beyond. If you like this illustration, I'd like to nudge you over to my Patreon page, where supporters at certain levels get every single illustration, including this one, that I do each month. Your support really helps me to make these videos. But if supporting the channel in that way doesn't seem fitting for you, then please make sure to like and favourite or share this video among the rest of your party so that YouTube knows that we're doing a good job and we can grow into a fabulously terrifying bone fairy matriarch from the tiny little tooth fairies that we are today. And until next time, happy monster hunting.